Thank you for tuning in live stream on YouTube and Facebook to Whitestone Missionary Baptist Church for our weekly Sunday school lesson presentation. We want to thank, or special thanks go out to our media ministry team, Reverend Henderson and Sister Fletcher, for making sure that we are able to serve you anytime we can. And this is the second or lesson 72, the 10th one for the fall quarter of 2021. This is the book, of course, I use or we use in honor and respects to our current superintendent, Sister Carolyn Jean Robinson Brooks, and to our superintendent emeritus, Brother William L. Baskin. Subject for this week is Moses' prayer and God's answer. The Bible text which this subject is based on is Numbers, the book of Numbers, chapter 14, verses 13 through 24. The theme for the book of Numbers is wilderness wanderings. The theme for November 7th through the 28th is taking God seriously. Theme for the fall quarter is faith on trial, which reminds you and me that our faith in God through Christ is always on trial. It's on trial throughout the day. It's on trial all the time in every given kind of situation. Happy Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving will be celebrated this month, the National Thanksgiving Day, but we celebrate as Christian Thanksgiving every day. The golden text is the 18th verse of that 14th chapter of Numbers, and I'll read it aloud. The Lord is long-suffering and of great mercy, forgiving iniquity and transgression, and by no means clearing the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generations. My comment is merely a quote by Dr. Ferguson on pages 133 and 134. Ferguson said this: children learn certain behaviors from their parents, and so on and on. This, or thus, the punishment for sin keeps going on down the family line. It becomes a family situation. God does not punish a child for what the parent does, but many times children grow up and perpetuate the sins of their parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents, and so forth. Chief commentator Robert Ferguson Jr., the lesson is divided into two sections. Section 1, Moses' great request, is highlighted in verses 13 through 19. And verses 13 and 14, a question is asked: what will the Egyptians say? Another question had to be answered in verses 15 and 16. What would the world say? And in verses 17 and 18, what does the Lord say? What does the Lord himself, what the Lord himself has said? Verses 17 and 18, what the Lord himself has said. Then, verse 19, what Moses prayed. We're told what he actually prayed. Who did he pray for, and on whose behalf did he pray for? Section 2 highlights verses 20 through 24. In verse 20, we see that there was a pardon asked for or granted for Israel. In verses 21, 22, and 23, punishment for the rebels still persisted. And verse 24 shares with us the exemption. There were two men exempted from the penalty or the punishment that God had orchestrated. Now, words define. I often share with us, all Sunday school teachers, all teachers on all levels, whether you're in the primary, whether you are senior high or senior adults or young adults, teenagers, middle school children, we need to have a good understanding or good command of the English language and the meaning of the words, not only the general meaning, but the meaning as it is given to us in the context in which we are dealing with. Attribute is the first one I mentioned. Character, traits, or marks, special features, sign, or quality of. Pardon, to be excused from a crime or a fault. Forgiven, to be let off easy. Intercession, pleading to God in this context for mercy on behalf of the Israelites. Dire, D-I-R-E, means terrible, awful. Exempt, E-X-E-M-P-T. Most of you are familiar with the word exempt in regard to internal revenue, tax. How many exemptions do you have? Example. To be declared or freed or spared. Petulant, P-E-T-U-L-A-N-T, means crabby, moody, or fretful. Sin is to err or wrongdoing, fall from grace. Judgment, decision-making, choice to punish or not to be punished. We notice the word request. In the lesson text, for example, in the context in which we are dealing with, Moses' prayer and God's answer. In verses 13 through 19, Moses' great request. What was his great request? The word request to ask for. Transgressions, open violation of some law or some rule, in this context, violating the rules of God for living misbehavior. Guilty, found to be at fault, out of line, convicted of. Prayer, communication with God, talk with God. Answer means response to a question or a request. Mercy means kindness, compassion, pity, or expressing or bringing relief to one who is found at fault, one who is guilty, one who is contrite, one who is very sorrowful for his or her act of wickedness or wrongdoing. Forgive, to end blame for, to grant pardon. To excuse for the guilt, to excuse for the act of misbehavior. Iniquity, evil, wickedness, gross misconduct without shame. We know we're wrong and we keep doing it. Long-suffering means, you notice in God is long-suffering, meaning God is patient, he's slow to anger. Beseech means to beg for or to plead for or plead on behalf of. Swear, you see in the text, S-W-A-R-E. It's simply another way of saying swear, S-W-E-A-R, to declare under oath, to give one's word. Slain means to slaughter, to kill. On page 131, Ferguson makes about 5 key points in the introduction on that page 131. Number 1, interceding for people who continually try to bring harm to you is a very, very difficult thing to do. The second point he makes, as Christians, we are to forgive, love, serve, and pray for our enemies. Take a study closely St. Matthew's chapter 5, verses 43 through 48, St. Luke chapter 6, verses 27 and 28, also Romans chapter 12, verse 20. Third point he makes, Moses learned to talk with God and trusted him solely, absolutely. Number 4, Moses never wavered in his love for the people or his people. Number 5, loving people, I quote directly from Ferguson, loving people who are not, who do not love, loving people who do not love, loving people who do not love us in return is not easy. Loving people who do not love us in return is not easy, but God will bless us for loving those who despitefully use us, who hurt us, who harm us. There are 10 questions on page 135 of the Adult Expositor needing answers. I hope to give you some brief answers. Number 1, how did Moses respond to God's offer to destroy the Israelites and start a new nation with him. God had, so to speak, thrown up his hands and said, I'm going to get rid of all these people. And Moses, because you have been faithful, I am going to start a new nation beginning with you. Well, Moses pleaded, at short answer, Moses pleaded with God on behalf of the very folks who rejected his leadership. Page 132. Moses was passing the test that God was testing him with. Number two, what did Moses argue that the pagan peoples would conclude if God destroyed Israel? Short answer. First, the negative report of the 10 spies would be shouted throughout Canaan, page 132. How would destroying the nation of Israel contradict God's own promise? Well, short answer. Moses pleaded for Israel, begged God on behalf of Israel not to destroy them. If God did do that, his divine promise would not have been kept. Page 133. Number four, how did Moses want God to display his great power? Short answer. Moses wanted God's power to be displayed for everyone to see. God's forgiveness of Israel was key to God's maintaining his integrity and greatness. Page 133. Question number five. To what did Moses appeal himself? To what did Moses appeal in the Lord's description of himself? Well, short answer. God described himself as long-suffering or slow to anger. He was and is very patient with us, merciful and forgiving. Page 133. Number six, on what basis did Moses appeal to God to pardon the people? On what basis did Moses appeal to God to pardon, to excuse, to declare not guilty? Well, short answer, it was the greatness of God's mercy, not the people's supposedly goodness. Page 134. Question 7. What does being pardoned for sin not mean? Answer. The fact that God had answered Moses' prayer did not mean there would be no consequences whatsoever for Israel's rebellion. Page 134. Number 8. What judgment did the Lord pronounce on the rebels? Short answer. These kinds of folks would not be allowed to be allowed in the promised land. They would not be allowed to enter into the promised land. Page 134. Number 9. How had Caleb demonstrated his faithfulness to the Lord? Short answer. Caleb went against popular opinion and the majority report. Page 135. Number 10. What two people were exempted from God's punishment or God's judgment? Answer, short answer, Caleb and Joshua, page 135. A few notes and quotes for food for thought. Dr. Black wants us to understand a few things. First, God is and always has been gracious. Second, God does not dismiss sin as nothing. Third, what grace means is that Christ, our substitute, bore the punishment for our sin, and this satisfied God's wrath against us and brings us salvation. See John chapter 3, verse 36, page 133. On page 136 of the expositor, Dr. Black says Black says that we are. On page 136, Dr. Black says that we are, number one, to illustrate that God hears and responds, the most important thing, God hears and responds to the sincere prayers of his faithful servants. The second thing Black wants us to be reminded of, second, we are to affirm, to verify, to testify to the power of prayer in changing circumstances, regardless of how dire, regardless of how terrible, how awful the situations may seem to be. And finally, we are to establish a consistent prayer life that demonstrates complete trust in and dependence on the Lord. Dr. Black also added on page 137 the following statement. Dr. Black said, a close look at verse 17, 18, and 19 gives us some food for thought. He added, Moses argued that the Lord's relenting and pardoning his people would be a great demonstration of his divine power and character. Dr. Hickman on page, Megan Hickman on page 138 said this. She said, we can always appeal to God's attributes, his character, in our time of need because he is unchanging. See verses, read and study carefully verses 16, 17, and 18 of the lesson text. Chelsea Villasenor also added, the Lord constantly showed mercy toward his people, even though they did not deserve it. Dr. Lodi on page 139 said something that stands out in my mind. I missed a word. Lodi said on page 139 something that stands out in my mind. Lodi said this, no other man demonstrated so much personal meekness and humility before God than Moses did. That's good news. On page 143, Dr. Spencer said this, our studies thus far have shown us the cynical nature, not only of the sin of the Israelites, but of our own sin in the 21st century as well. We sin on an average person. We sin, we suffer the consequences. We beg God for mercy, get reprieved or get forgiven, and then we start sinning all over again. Thank God we have a Savior in Jesus Christ who has redeemed us from the wicked cycle of death. See Romans chapter 7, verse 24 and 25. Finally, from the Children's Corner, Dr. Spencer says some very important things that we shouldn't take lightly. We ought to take God seriously at his word. Well, Dr. Spencer said this, Moses is or was a good example of someone who always placed God's glory and the welfare of those he served above his own interest. Although Moses grew weary from the people constantly complaining all the time, he was given more horrified. He was even more terrified or horrified by the thought that all of Israel might be destroyed. That was a really chilly, dark situation to believe that all the people you see, everybody will be wiped away but you. I remember the late Reverend K.T. Whalen, who pastored Olivet Missionary Baptist Church for decades, told me when I was installed as pastor here at Whitestone, he said these words, love the people, preach the word, and serve the people well by God's standards. I hope and pray that you will join us for worship at 11 o'clock. God bless you.